we go. So, with my tea. So we're going to start looking at classical music. And it's such a big topic. The one thing I have realized is that we will really only be touching the surface on how much time we could spend going into it. Because I mean, looking at individual like instrumentation and stuff like that, we could go on for hours, I think. So I've tried to look at the stuff that's the most sort of relatable, I guess, that we can relate to our respective genres of music. And actually, whilst I was looking through some of it, I thought it could be really interesting, especially knowing both of us as musicians. I think it could be quite a cool exploration for us, I guess. So I had a look at some sort of basic formats of stuff. So this week I was just thinking about learning like literally just the main structure rules. So like what sections there are, how long they are normally or whatever. So I've got like, there's quite a big selection, but they're all very specific. And actually if you think about like classical music, people that are composers, especially people like Mozart or Beethoven, they're all their pieces are called very specific things, and there's like even a format for the name, so it's got the key signature in, and whether it's a concerto or a symphony or whatever, and that basically as a composer you have all these things and you go, oh, I'm going to write a, I don't know, sonata today or whatever, and that was really interesting to me, because it feels really restrictive again, but actually there is also a lot of freedom within it, I guess. So I had a little look at the words binary and ternary. So I remember hearing about them in GCSE, like I remember learning about them. But I think essentially it's just like binary is when there are two contrasting sections, and I think they're quite big sections, and ternary is when there's three. And so I think there are different sub formats as well, so subcategories within that. But essentially binary is when there's just like two main sections, and ternary is three. And then I also had a look at just some of them are just terms that are useful to think about and have a basic definition of. So like movements, and you know, movements tend to make up bigger pieces of music within classical music. Normally the pace of a movement is fast, slow, fast. So within a movement, there's a fast beginning, and there's a slow middle, and then there's a fast end. And that was really interesting to think about how that could be applied to the music we make. Because I suppose you could just apply it very literally and just have like, I don't know, a song that's got three main sections and the middle one is slower than the other two. And then there are like the specific like compositions themselves. So a sonata, which is normally like a solo instrument. So either it will be just a piano, or if it's another instrument, they'll often be accompanied by a piano. So as much as I think that could be interesting to explore, I guess like pop music, that happens a lot as well, where you have just a singer and a piano player or guitar player or whatever. Cadenza, which is like a part of, so I think from what I've read, cadenza and aria are very similar, but aria is like this, but in opera music, but I'm trying to avoid looking at vocals, so we're not really going to look at opera music, because again, there's a whole other big exploration that can happen there. And I don't know enough about it without researching, if I'm being honest. No. So I thought I'd go for just the instrumental stuff. So a cadenza is like essentially a solo within a concerto. And then there's a symphony, which is sort of implied that there's a big orchestra with wind and brass and woodwind involved. And then a concerto, which is just like a soloist and an orchestra. And so I think the two that like seem really interesting to me is like the symphony and the concerto, and how you would think about like arrangement of instruments without any vocals. So either you do a soloist, like you have an instrument you decide you're gonna write a solo for, and then, but within our own genres of music, I think it could be quite interesting.
Yeah.
And the symphony, I guess, is just like, the symphony is something I've always like been really interested in, but it feels like climbing a mountain. It feels like there are so many instruments, if like where the melody is changes like throughout the piece, and I think they can be really moving, and I think they can be really beautiful, but not knowing anything about how I'd even go about writing one. So in terms of like the practical side of what we could do, I don't think it's going to be as simple as each week we'll try something. I think what I'd like is for us to have like an end goal of either trying to write a classical piece of music if you want, because we have the technology to be able to do that, the two of us, or like using your genre that you write in. So even if it's just like an acoustic guitar piece, for example, that you then write other instruments over the top, trying to make like an instrumental piece of music that we really love, using some of the things that are apparent in classical music. So I'd quite like to think about like the comparisons between the two. So like you said that you were going to do a little bit of reading. Did you come across anything you found interesting?
Well, so I from my research went back through. I studied classical guitar, so I went back through all my grade pieces and back through especially like my grade 8 theory stuff for my classical, and looked at the difference in the scales I'd done for the rock school stuff and the scales I'd done for classical stuff. And your knowledge of modes and sort of the way that modes work and how their sounds can be different is something that I found there's a lot more of. People can just set in a mode and don't deviate.
Yeah.
Which you don't see very often happening in pop music. You see little references to modes and then you're back into a major or minor key.
Yeah, it's like an accident moment, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know how many people know they're doing it, but
I'm sure there are some, but I think there's a lot of like commercial songs that, yeah, I think people do it by accident without realizing.
Yeah. So I found that really interesting, and when classical music works counterpoint is something that I've taken into my playing since I studied it. Especially with guitar, but with all other instruments. Splitting with guitar, we have to split your hand into 3 sections. So you can, in theory, play in 3 time signatures over your guitar. So you've got your little finger and your ring finger running all of your top line melodies, and your index finger and your middle finger, they're running all of your chords and sort of harmony, and then your thumb's running all of your bass line. And that's what I've taken into my finger picking now for my folk stuff. I think it happens all the way through classical music. They're not understanding of octaves and different sort of counterpoint melodies. This stuff sort of gets glossed over when pop music and commercial music happens.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really interesting. The how one instrument like an acoustic, especially guitars, I think, because there's so many elements, and like even with a bass guitar as well, I think people assume that it's just for the root notes. I think there's so much more to it because it combines the harmonic content of a piece with the rhythmic piece, like the rhythmic side. And so having an instrument like a guitar, when you can do all 3 of those things, really, like the melody and the harmony and the rhythm, especially as like you say, it's learning like an instrument classically and non-classically is very different. I remember when I was, I think I started when I was in primary school, but I used to play the flute, and I got up to grade 8, but I almost wanted to learn jazz flute so that my teacher could do classical or jazz, and I remember being really torn between the two, but I went for classical in the end because I'd had so long training in that it made sense to do that. But but jazz flute is so much different. Like the scales you learn, the techniques you learn, are all very different things.
Yeah.
And I remember I did for I think it was my grade 8, I did a piece, I think it's called The Great Train Race. And it's really fun to play on the flute because it's like you get to sing and play at the same time, and you do all these really interesting modern techniques of playing that you don't see on flute really ever. It's probably like the beginnings of beatboxing flute, I'd say, but like it was one of my grade 8 pieces and it was really exciting.
Yeah.
So especially like I haven't spent a lot of time looking at modern composers of music, and I think maybe I should, because I think there's some really interesting stuff going on. And then you think about like someone that I really love is Einaudi, because it's not, I mean, it sounds complicated what he's playing on piano, but I think it's really palatable, I guess. Yeah. So it does what we expect it to do, and it makes us feel nice, and it's really relaxing, and actually they can be really emotive. And I like that it's kind of, I think there's a lot of people that sort of turn their nose up at music like that. But instrumental music has the power to be really powerful. Especially like at the moment with all the people that are studying or people that work that like to listen to music, but often they like to listen to music and not have vocals going on. Like if you're reading a book, I can't read a book and listen to music with words because I just yeah. And all the Spotify playlists of like, you know, relaxing jazz or piano emotional music or like coffee vibe playlists. Like, there's so much, like people are really.
I think lo-fi hip hop as well. Like they've been the ones that I've seen the most of going around, especially like Spotify and Apple Music.
Yeah,
everyone seems to be focusing on those.
Yeah,
lo-fi hip hop.
Yeah, and I think actually like some lo-fi hip hop, like the structure that they use, is not massively complex. In fact, you could probably argue that it follows some similar structures to classical music and like the ABA thing.
Yeah.
Because it just needs to be sort of ongoing, doesn't it? So, no, absolutely. So I guess some notes I made about comparisons. So like with everything we've looked at so far, there are really obvious similarities and obvious differences. I think the similarity is that there are rules, really, and I think the differences are what the rules are.
Yeah.
Which sounds very basic, but sometimes you need to say the simple things, don't you?
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah. But so I think what I was really interested in thinking about when I was researching is how to apply these basic bones of a structure to the music that we make. So thinking of just going completely out of the box for like trying to do a pop song, for example, that's, I don't know, like 3 movements, and each movement is like fast, but obviously it might have to be quite a big song, like either one really long song or you like 3 or 4 songs that are they all have similar themes and motifs and whatever, but like are different. And actually, I don't know about you, but as like someone that writes commercial style music, the idea of writing something really similar to something you've already made is actually quite terrifying.
Yeah.
Because we're so from being like, it needs to be new and it needs to be different and it needs to be exciting. And so actually challenging ourselves to write 3 song EP that there is similar, like you can tell that it's part of one big piece. Probably like Bonnie there probably does it quite well.
Yeah,
it's like it feels like the albums are like a whole piece of music, and I find it really hard to pick songs out. There are a couple that I really like, but like in general, I just like listening to the whole thing.
Yeah.
So I think thinking like that could be quite interesting. In your like guitar playing, do you find that there's any sort of obvious similarities or differences in the guitar world of classical music?
The guitar world is sort of it's a very different. Unless you're doing finger picking, it's a very different ball game. If you're a finger picker, and to be fair, it's quite sort of like different to quite a lot of like the country style finger picking and those sort of things, where you've got repeating patterns and you're using it to arpeggiate chords. Whereas in classical music, you're not doing that, and it's a thing called broken chords, where you're only holding one or two notes of the chord and playing melodies and bass lines over the top.
Yeah.
And that I don't really see that in anything. I do it in mine as much as possible, but it's very difficult to write that. You need to basically split it in half, like into 3 sections, and go, what are my chords? Where are my melodies? Where's my bass line? And then force your hand to play 3 separate things at once.
Yeah.
But I don't really see it. I see it maybe with Radiohead. Radiohead, something like, trying to think of a song, like Weird Fishes. All of those looping, building triplet guitar parts that stack on top of each other and then reharmonize as they build. I mean, that's very classical guitar-esque.
Yeah.
But using technology and looping.
Yeah, it's also like I remember, this is probably something we'll look at a bit more next week, the word sequence, I think, which I remember learning about, which is when often like there'll be a bass part or like a string part that's just like a bit like an arpeggiator, but in classical music sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it sounds quite simple.
I think as producers, like I found it more that the producers I speak to are more fixed in on that sort of layering and building structure than necessarily songwriters are, because their job not to put the song together, it's to make sure that continues to be interesting and adds layers, and adds texture, and they think in a more classical way necessarily than most songwriters I know.
Yeah.
Just by definition of what their job is.
Yeah. You have to know. Yeah, you have to know how a lot of instruments work, even if you can't play them. It's why often like producers will have like session players they trust more than anyone. So they'll probably have people the go-to guy, unless their musician is requesting someone else. So if you don't have the skills to do it as well as you'd like to, or I mean, like if you're using electronic sounds, samples and loops, means that you have access to quite a lot anyway, but also it's quite easy nowadays to program the basics of each instrument, and that makes the arrangement part really interesting. And I think like what I've come to realize in the last few weeks of doing this project especially is how important it is to actually take the time to listen to as much different music as you can. I think we think that we only have to listen to music we like, and actually sometimes it can be really interesting to listen to stuff that we don't like. And actually, I really like most classical music. I think there are some pieces that are some of my favorite pieces of music. Although I'm really bad at remembering the names of them. Like there's a Vaughan Williams piece that I learned in A level, and like I fell in love with it when we were researching it, and now it's like one of my go-to things. But there's also a lot of classical music that I don't connect with. It's not that I don't like it, but when you just like you listen to it and you're like, I'm just not really getting it. And I think those are the pieces that are also really important to listen to and to really, I don't know, especially as musicians when we're trying to write. Having never looked at poetry really before, looking at it in the last few weeks has really opened my eyes to different. It feels like it's just given me a bit of a refresher on lyric writing.
Yeah.
So that's cool. So so there's nothing specific that I want us to try and do. I just want us to start thinking about a structure of a piece that we might try having a go at in the future. So for me, for example, what I like the idea of doing is like, I don't know, a 3-track EP, because normally I try and do more, but I think I'm actually just gonna try and do like, and think of each song as a movement, and that's like as far as I'm gonna go until we start talking about some of the other elements. So next week, I'd like to look at, just to prepare you, sort of how classical music take little melodic phrases and develop them, and like in as much detail as we can. So that's probably what we'll do next week. So I think that's everything. But yeah, the basic of this week was just sort of looking at the structure and how the similarities with popular music is that there are rules in structure, and the rules themselves are the things that vary, and the instruments that play them, obviously. Yeah, I'm gonna stop the